All right, interrupting that report to take you back to the UN Human Rights Council, where the Qatari representative is speaking.
The member states of the Gulf Cooperation Council and the Hashemite Kingdom of Jordan, launched by Iran, with grave repercussions that are not only affecting peace and security in the world, but also human rights. We firmly condemn the attacks by drones and missiles. Such attacks have undermined our territorial integrity, violating the UN Charter, including the principle of not using force or threatening to use it. These strikes, which have targeted civilians or civilian infrastructure, amount to a gross violation of international humanitarian law and international human rights law. Vital infrastructure such as airports and ports have been targeted, as have water desalination plants. These do not pose this poses a threat to the region's security and also violates human rights law. These attacks amount to a great source of concern for us, and we can no longer remain silent. We have been affected by ballistic missile strikes and rocket strikes. This has caused victims among civilians and undermined the water and power supply services, thereby threatening the right to safety and life. To attack the electricity and desalination plants also involves serious environmental consequences and undermines rights that are guaranteed by human rights provisions. Such measures threaten the lives of the most vulnerable, including women and children. It makes their lives more difficult and violates the Convention on the Rights of the Child and the Convention on the Rights of Persons with Disabilities. President, the targeting of maritime ways, including the Strait of Hormuz, are a source of great concern, given the dire consequences they can have on the economy and supply routes. It also has an impact on the enjoyment of economic and social rights and the right to development in a number of states, including in developing countries. We therefore would like to recall that to protect navigation and civilian infrastructure is a moral and ethical duty that must not be undermined. Blocking the strait cannot advance the settlement of the situation in any way, and to attack a state that is not a party to the conflict and which has not allowed use of its territory in the hostilities is a violation of international law and undermines international peace and security. We have dissociated ourselves from the outset from this war, and we have refused to be part of the escalation. However, Iranians continue to target us and other neighbouring countries too, thereby undermining international peace and security. We would like to reiterate the inherent right of countries to defend themselves, the legitimate right to self-defense in keeping with the UN Charter and international law. My country would like to commend the UN Security Council resolution, which firmly condemned attacks against the Gulf states and Jordan. These attacks constitute a violation of international law and threaten international peace and security. We would like to reaffirm that the necessary reparation must be provided to the affected states and affected civilians. The State of Qatar, President, considers that human rights, peace, security and development are interdependent elements. To assault one affects the others. That is why the handling of this crisis requires a comprehensive approach in order to strengthen peaceful solutions. We call for an immediate end to the escalation, for a return to political efforts, and for dialogue to prevail so as to safeguard human dignity. We call on the Human Rights Council to shoulder its responsibilities by supporting this resolution and by closely monitoring these violations, and to take all necessary measures so as to protect human rights and avoid any repetition. Thank you.
Thank you. I now give the floor to the distinguished representative of Saudi Arabia.
السيد الرئيس تشكر المملكة العربية السعودية.
Thank you, President. The Kingdom of Saudi Arabia would like to thank the Council for meeting our request to hold an urgent debate. We condemn the attacks by Iran against our kingdom and the member states of the Gulf Cooperation Council, as well as Jordan. These are states that are not parties to the current conflict, and these Iranian attacks amount to a gross violation of state sovereignty, of their territorial integrity. They violate the UN Charter and international law. President, we must call things by their name. To target a neighbor is a violation of the principles of good neighborly relations. To target the mediator betrays all efforts aimed at peace and undermines any constructive initiative. To target states that are not party to the hostilities amounts to unacceptable and unjustifiable attacks that cannot be passed over in silence. Iranian attacks represent an approach that is based on the use of militia, the attack of neighboring countries in order to undermine stability. These attacks, which seek to undermine the region's peace and stability, represent a gross violation of international law and pose a direct threat to international peace and security. Iran's attacks are aimed at claiming civilian lives, and they have targeted civilian infrastructure and energy infrastructure, which is a gross violation of international law, including international humanitarian law and international human rights law. We have heard attempts by Iran to evade all responsibility, and yet you cannot deny what the world clearly sees. Iran cannot escape responsibility here. To continue to follow the same approach will lead Iran nowhere. It will merely further isolate the country. My kingdom would like to recall that Iran should review its methods and end its attacks, because continuing attacks against neighboring countries would not bring any benefits in the conflict to Iran. We condemn Iran's attacks against commercial vessels in the Gulf and the suspension of navigation in the Strait of Hormuz, which is having an impact on the region and the rest of the world, and which worsens the economic situation at the international level while having an impact on most vulnerable countries, including the least developed countries and poorest countries. We would like to recall that attacks against energy infrastructure and supply chains, especially as regards food goods, also has an impact on the global situation. Finally, President, silence is not a choice. This Council must take all necessary measures so as to address these unjustified Iranian attacks while preserving protection of civilians and civilian infrastructure. My kingdom calls for states to support and co-sponsor draft resolution L38. We would like to express our deepest gratitude to those states that have expressed their support for this draft resolution. We are working with the core group to engage in consultations with all states so as to agree on wording that can garner consensus and reflect the position of the international community in the face of these attacks by Iran. Thank you, President.
Thank you. I give the floor now to the distinguished representative of the United Arab Emirates.
السيد الرئيس تواصل بلادي الإمارات العربية.
We have been listening there to a special emergency session of the United Nations Human Rights Council in Geneva, a special session which was called by the United Arab Emirates on the war in the region and the attacks, more specifically by Iran on Gulf countries. We heard from the UN Human Rights Chief earlier, who called on the attacks on civilian infrastructure in the region to continue. We also heard from the Qatari representative, Hind Rahman al-Muftah, the permanent representative of the state of Qatar to the UN Human Rights Office in Geneva, to the UN office in Geneva, I should say. She said that to attack a state that is not a party to the conflict and that does not allow its territory to be used in the conflict is a violation of international law, a grave violation, she said. And she said that attacks on airports, desalination plants and electricity infrastructure is also a grave violation of the human rights of the citizens and residents of the region. We also heard from the Saudi representative, Abdulmohsen Majed Bin Khothaila, who talked about the attacks on the region, condemning Iran's attacks on the Kingdom of Saudi Arabia and GCC countries, saying that Iran cannot escape responsibility for these attacks and that the Human Rights Council must take measures to address the unjustified Iranian attacks. We'll keep a close eye on what's happening in Geneva today and bring you the latest here on Al Jazeera.